Good to see you. I'm 60. I kind of was thinking last week now, isn't it? Because Sunday's the first day of the week. I get excited about coming to church. I look forward to it. And this morning, I was just thinking about how, as a congregation, we encourage each other and we point one another to the Lord. And so we've had the generosity, we've had the video, we've sung in song, we've heard loud amens and hallelujahs to prayers, and we've had James leading us. We've had 3 people come out and share. So, you know, Sandra sharing Dave's testimony. Oh, lovely. School, work colleagues, wife, pointing him to Jesus. It's lovely. And then the John Lennox reference. I got up once to preach, 200 or 300 people, 200 probably, 250. And just there, in the second row, was John Lennox. And I just thought, oh dear me, he should be preaching, particularly as it was Genesis chapter 1, and that's something that he's done a lot on. And yeah, so that was an interesting morning, but a man very worth listening to. You can go on YouTube and you can find various conversations. Now, the thing I sent round recently was about John Lennox being interviewed about finishing well, because he's into his 80s. And in that interview, he's asked about anybody who he knew who finished well, and he refers to a man called Nigel Lee. And I had the privilege of being in the same church as Nigel and learning from him. Wonderful man. And then we had Alan, didn't we, referring to Mr. Wiseman. Again, so encouraging. And that kind of leads us into Esther, because we're going to be talking about the Jews. Now, I'm going to start off with a little word of warning. I've just done an introduction of 2 or 3 minutes there. I think normally when I speak, it's about 25 minutes or so. Kind of get yourself comfortable, because with this one, because we're trying to do the whole book of Esther, it's going to be slightly longer. So my apologies in a sense at the beginning. But a few weeks ago, we looked at the first 2 chapters of Esther, and then we dipped into the start of chapter 3. And this morning, I'd like us to look at chapters 3 to 5, and James has kindly read chapter 4 to us, which is a key chapter and some key verses in the whole book of Esther. And last time, you'll recall, if you were with us in chapters 1 and 2, we saw a proud and unwise King Xerxes divorce Queen Vashti because she didn't comply with his drunken demand to parade her beauty before an audience of drunken men. And then we saw the orphan Jewish girl Esther win the king's heart to become the new queen in what must have surely been the mother of all beauty contests. And then we had the surprise of Mordecai exposing an assassination attempt, but not receiving any recognition for it. And we concluded our study by seeing King Xerxes promote a man called Haman. And this seemed somewhat unfair, because it was Mordecai that had alerted the king to the assassination conspiracy. But with the introduction of Haman to the narrative, we now have all the main characters in place for the plots and the schemes that follow in the remaining chapters of the book. So chapter 3 begins with a surprise promotion. Certainly in terms of the narrative so far, it seems out of the blue. This is the first time we hear of this man called Haman. And an edict goes out from the king that honour is to be given to Haman, and all the royal officials kneel down before him, apart from one, Mordecai the Jew. Haman learns of Mordecai's defiance, and he's so furious that he cooks up a plot not only to wipe out Mordecai, but all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire, which stretched from India to Ethiopia. King Xerxes was then manipulated by Haman into signing a genocidal death warrant. And so in looking at chapters 3 to 5, what I'd like us to do is do so and base our thinking around the characters involved. And so what we're going to do is we're going to consider firstly Haman's hatred, and then we'll consider Mordecai's misery, and then thirdly we'll look at Esther's entrance, and along with it God's intervention. So we begin with Haman's hatred. Adolf Hitler in Germany, Joseph Stalin in the USSR, Mao Zedong in China, Idi Amin in Uganda, Kim Il-sung in North Korea, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia. Together, it's estimated that those 20th century tyrants were responsible for killing around 70 million people. It's just in the 20th century. The heart of man can be desperately wicked. And sadly, the slaughter of innocent people by their leaders is nothing new. And as we read the pages of Esther, we encounter another of these psychopathic leaders who was bent on the destruction of an innocent people group. And we'll see that Haman's hatred was immense. As we've already said, at the start of chapter 3, for a reason that isn't documented, Haman was promoted by King Xerxes to a place of special honour. And one royal official, Mordecai, refused to kneel down to him. End of verse 2. Last time I mentioned that I had a boss who fitted the Xerxes mould. Well, a few years prior to him, I had another boss who was also a rather unpleasant character. And he was not my direct boss, but he sat 2 or 3 tiers further up the management chain of command. And he was a very rotund guy. And he was known within the department as the fat controller. And that's because he was fat, and it's because he was a control freak. It was not a term of affection or endearment. And one of his... he was a guy who was incredibly status conscious. And anybody he considered further down the food chain from him, he treated with considerable contempt. And one of his status quirks was to sit in his office, and anybody who visited him in his office had to wear their suit jacket as a mark of respect. Well, one day, as a kind of more junior member of his department, I was told that I was going to get called into his office and given a pat on the back and a promotion. And so I decided when I got the call that I would deliberately leave my jacket on the back of my chair and see whether he told me off first or congratulated me first. And it turned out he congratulated me first, gave me the promotion, and then as I was leaving his office, he said, "Never come back into my office again without your jacket on. I can sit here without my jacket on, but you must wear one whenever you come to see me." Now, why did I do that? In all honesty, sheer mischief. I didn't like his attitude, and I thought it would be fun to wind him up. Now, I'm not saying that my stance was correct. Please don't think that I'm advocating disrespect and winding up your boss. I was young. It was kind of slightly out of character for me in a sense. But on reflection, there was no reason why I shouldn't have been compliant. So really, I was in the wrong. But getting back to Mordecai, why did he refuse to pay respect to Haman? Was it just mischief-making and an effort to wind him up? What was his problem? Well, the text doesn't give us an explicit reason. Commentators suggest 3 possibilities, some more likely than others. Firstly, it could be that Mordecai refused to bow down to him because Mordecai was a Jew and he was obeying the second commandment, which was not to bow down to idols. That actually seems unlikely because the issue here was one of respect and honour, not idolatry. Secondly, and perhaps kind of more probably, it could be that Mordecai was hacked off because he just received no official recognition for uncovering the conspiracy in chapter 2. And as I mentioned last time, Persian rulers would reward such people with a benefits package, and that benefits package included not to have to bow down to other nobles. So perhaps that goes some way to explaining the defiance. And then there's commentators suggest a third possibility, actually what you might refer to as a family feud. You see, in chapter 2, verse 5, we're told that Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin and descended from Kish. And that means he was linked to King Saul, Israel's first king. And there was unfinished business between the family of Saul and the family of Haman, in a sense, because Haman, according to chapter 3, verse 1, was an Agagite, and he was descended from the Amalekites, whom God had told Saul to destroy in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But Saul had not carried out God's instruction and not destroyed the Amalekites. So there might have been some bubbling history. We don't know. For whatever reason, Mordecai refused to pay honour to Haman. And we ought to ask whether his defiance was right or not. To go back to me not putting my jacket on, was the defiance right or not? Was Mordecai right to defy Haman? And whilst we can't be categoric, I'm not sure that he was right in his stance. You see, it was in direct contradiction to the king's commands. We know that the Bible is a book of truth, and so often it presents the history of its characters, warts and all, the good and the bad. And it seems to me that maybe while he would have been very inwardly frustrated, Mordecai perhaps should have been humbly obeying the king's edict because it didn't necessarily contradict God's law. God's people are called to obey the law of the land. And Mordecai's defiance had consequences. It triggered a crisis of monumental proportions for the Jewish diaspora within the Persian Empire. And perhaps it need not have happened, but as we said last time, God overrules wrongdoing and accomplishes his purposes. And so despite Mordecai's stubbornness, we've already seen that God was planning the salvation of his people. Esther was already in a position of royal influence. She was queen. There are lessons for us in this. Firstly, let's be encouraged that despite at times our waywardness, God can overrule and can choose to be very gracious and overrule. And we see this with Mordecai in the later chapters of the book. But it comes, I think, with a little bit of a word of warning. Let's not think that we can play fast and loose. Let's not think that we can be reckless in living our lives and that God will always turn poor choices around. If we do wrong and we make bad decisions, God may not always choose to overrule, and we may well suffer the consequence of those choices. So, for example, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we read of David taking Bathsheba and committing adultery, and James has recently preached a series of sermons on Bathsheba, and if you've not had an opportunity to listen to those, or if you've missed them, I would highly recommend that you do listen to them. Ultimately, David was forgiven by God, but it didn't mean that he didn't suffer the consequences of what he'd done. And for the rest of his reign, there was tremendous disrespect and trouble coming from within his own family. In Mordecai's situation, God was ultimately very gracious to him. Secondly, we maybe should think about how we react and take a stance when something we don't like happens or someone is perhaps promoted ahead of us. And again, in a work context, many years ago, I'd applied for a job. I was well qualified for it, and everybody kind of thought it was likely to be a done deal and expected me to get it, and I didn't, because of office politics, and somebody was given that position, not because of competence, but because of who they'd influenced and what they knew. And I was somewhat kind of hacked off, and others were too, and felt that it was a bit of an injustice. But the issue really is one of how do we best handle and respond in such situations? And we need to do so with grace. And maybe Mordecai's reaction was perhaps unnecessarily defiant. We could debate that, and I'm not going to die in a ditch on it, so to speak. Anyway, chapter 3, verse 4 tells us that Mordecai's stance continued day after day. And the verse goes on to tell us that it was the other royal officials who dropped him in it. They were perhaps a bunch of stirrers maybe. They asked him why he was digging his heels in, and all he told them was that he was Jewish. Maybe that gives us a hint as to why he was doing what he was doing. We just don't know precisely. Anyway, they went off and reported him to Haman to see how Haman would react and whether such behaviour would be tolerated. And maybe they got what they wanted, a full display of fireworks in verse 5. Haman was enraged. And there is no sense to evil, and there is no sense to evil men. Had Haman been reasonable, he would have perhaps confronted Mordecai, endeavoured to understand what the problem was, and perhaps even prosecuted him for breaking the law or bring to bear some sort of discipline. But Haman wasn't reasonable. He was an evil man with a massive ego, and chapter 5, verse 11 refers to his boasting, and chapter 6, verse 6 shows us something of the inflated ego that he had. And his rage was unbelievable. And in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 3, he wasn't just content with exacting revenge on Mordecai, he wanted to wipe out all of the Jews in the Persian Empire. And so he hatched a despicable plot. He went off to the king and told him there was an openly rebellious people. Well, I suspect that was not just stretching the truth, but a lie. He was bothered about one guy. He offered a bribe. Verse 9 was the money he offered in verse 9 of chapter 3 was about 2/3 of the annual income of the Persian Empire. It was a colossal sum of money. How he was in possession of it, we just don't know. Or perhaps where he was going to get it from, we don't know. Maybe his plan was to take the loot from the Jews once they were killed. And sadly, King Xerxes asked no questions. He took no advice. He didn't investigate Haman's outrageous claims for himself. He just passed across his signet ring, the royal seal of approval, and in verse 10, he let Haman get on with it. That was an abysmal way to lead. If you ever find yourself in a position of leadership, you'll never have to deal with Haman in this particular scenario, but you may well have to deal with somebody who has a personal agenda, somebody who's trying to manipulate you, somebody who is trying to do something that's unfair to others. If you're in a position of leadership, do not take the Xerxes approach. Challenge and question and check things out for yourself and be prepared to push back and be prepared to say no. And if you're a leader, then be a leader and be careful about being manipulated. Xerxes was weak, ineffective, manipulated, and consequently he was dangerous. So Haman, with the approval of the king, puts in place this despicable law, and there was to be no mercy for the Jews whatsoever. And verse 13 sets out the brutality of it: destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, and plunder their goods. And the final verse of chapter 3 is chilling. It's utterly chilling. The edict has been published, and it says the king and Haman sat down to drink. No conscience, almost as though it was all in a day's work. Let's just set genocide in motion. Now let's have a drink. Let's sit back, kick back and relax. It's utterly chilling. Well, what are we to make of Haman's hatred? In a sense, not much has changed. There are still evil men perpetrating crimes of brutality and violence against innocent victims all around the world. How are we to understand it? How are we to make sense of it all? How do we get our heads around these Haman characters and the pain that they cause? There are no easy answers. And this side of heaven, there'll be some suffering that we never truly understand. But for the Jews scattered across the Persian Empire, God was planning a way of salvation through Esther. The book of Esther tells us that God rules over all. He's in charge. He overrules the evil. And ultimately, he accomplishes his purposes and brings salvation. And so if we want to keep ourselves from being overwhelmed by the evil that we see around us, sometimes we experience it, sometimes we observe it. If we want to keep ourselves being overwhelmed by it, we need to look at the one who is ultimately God's salvation for the world. We need to have our eyes on Jesus. Make no mistake about it. We do live in a moral universe, and we can be confident that ultimately perfect justice will be administered by him. Those evil men that do evil things will be held to account. And I'll touch more on the question of justice next time we look at Esther. But in the meantime, Haman's hatred caused an inevitable response. And that's the second of our main headings. It resulted in Mordecai's misery. It also resulted in misery for the exiled Jews. And their distress is described in chapter 4, James read to us. Verse 3 tells us that in every province there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. What must it have been like for them to have had a law published that said, in 11 months' time, you and your family will all be killed? Can you imagine a law being passed that said, next October, anyone who wants to can destroy, kill, or annihilate Christian families? 11 months, the clock starts ticking. And the situation the Jews found themselves in raises two profound issues. Firstly, why were they hated so much? And secondly, whilst they were in exile because they had disobeyed the Lord and turned from him, this incident, in a sense, they'd not brought upon themselves. And so it raises the enormous issue of unjust suffering. But let's take the first question. Why were they hated so much? Many years ago, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, Lord Jakobowitz, was interviewed on TV by Terry Wogan. And Terry Wogan asked him, why have the Jews been persecuted so greatly through the generations? Why do people hate you so much? And Jakobowitz replied, it is dislike of the unlike. Dislike of the unlike. You see, the Jews were different. The Jews are different. There was something distinctly different about them in Esther's day, and there were those who hated them for it. They were a people chosen by God to represent his glory. But they were hated. And sadly, throughout the centuries since, very little changes. And even today, we see it, there is still an irrational hatred of Jews. How many of those that we, have got, problems with Jews know anything about what Alan referred to this morning? We see it, and we have seen an irrational hatred of Jews on our streets for the last 2 years, with the hate marches that seem to have been going on week after week. We saw it in Birmingham recently with the, dare I say it, confected outrage or the excuse of the Maccabi Tel Aviv Aston Villa football match. People used it as an opportunity for hating Jews. And sadly, Britain is becoming a fearful place to be a Jew. Dislike of the unlike. And it is the same for the Church of Jesus Christ around the world. We serve the one who declared himself exclusively to be the way, the truth, and the life. The only way to God. And that irks people. Jesus said himself in John 15, verse 18, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. And speaking of future events in Matthew 24, Jesus warned, you will be hated by all nations because of me. Right from its birth, the church has experienced hatred and persecution. And in some countries, many countries in particular, and even in sections of our own society, there is an irrational hatred of Christians. So in a sense, it shouldn't surprise us. what we see. We aren't called to be deliberately obnoxious or irksome. In fact, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 12, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. But we are called to be salt and light, and to be such makes an impact. Light exposes darkness, and it isn't always appreciated by those who want to remain in the darkness. And so whilst it's awful, let's not be surprised when Christians are disliked or even hated. Persecution takes place around the world. It shouldn't surprise us. It's irrational, but we should be supporting in prayer and by other means, if we can, those around the world in the church that are persecuted. Well, the hatred of the Jews led to this edict to wipe them out, and that raises this whole question of unjust suffering. They didn't bring it upon themselves. If you find yourself this morning in the midst of suffering of one sort or another, how in this short space of time that we've got can we meaningfully comment on such an enormous issue? So please forgive me if my comments are all too brief, because the issue of suffering is not a philosophical one. Few, if any of us, go through life unscathed or untouched by troubles or suffering of one sort or another. So it is very real. But perhaps our starting point in dealing with suffering is to understand that Jesus suffered. And as a consequence, he understands, like no one else, the suffering and the pain that we endure. Our neighbours, our friends, our family, our church fellowship, they might not be able to fully understand what we go through at times. But we can turn to Jesus. You can take your hurts to him, knowing that he understands the difficulties that you face. Never was there any suffering like his suffering. Never was there suffering as deep as his. Secondly, and this is perhaps an awkward thing to say, there is also reason behind our suffering. Job in the Old Testament suffered immensely. And as we read through the book of Job, we get to the end of it, and it appears that Job was never told that there was reason behind his suffering, but there was. And you read it at the beginning of the book of Job, where God allowed Job's suffering to prove a point to Satan. And the point was this: a man will serve God for nothing. Romans 5 teaches us that there's purpose in suffering, to the extent that it produces perseverance, character, and hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts. James chapter 1 reinforces it by telling us that suffering develops us and matures us. And in Psalm 119, verse 67, David acknowledged that before he was afflicted, he went astray, but afterwards he obeyed the word of God. Some suffering can actually bring us back to God. So if you're in the midst this morning of suffering, be it loneliness, physical difficulties, family problems, relationship issues, depression, financial troubles, whatever it might be, then take it to Jesus, knowing that he fully understands. And perhaps take some comfort that as you face your difficulties, there is purpose in them. There is reason. Although maybe this side of heaven, we might never find out what that reason is. And let's never forget that as Christians, we are called to carry one another's burdens. We're called to support one another. And so in our suffering, we should be able to turn to our fellow Christians. And it's interesting to note that neither Mordecai nor the Jews kept their suffering to themselves. And so we read in chapter 4, verse 1, or James read, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. It's not perhaps the English way, is it, to wail loudly and bitterly? we don't necessarily often share our suffering, perhaps. But Mordecai chose to deal with his suffering in that way. And so if you are internalizing some suffering, then perhaps you ought to think about sharing it with something. There is nothing wrong in the midst of suffering with wailing loudly and bitterly. Well, need to move on and consider the third of our headings, Esther's entrance into the king's presence. And through it, God's intervention in this whole crisis. News of Mordecai's distress reached Esther in chapter 4, and they talked about the crisis through this go-between called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs. Mordecai urged Esther in verse 8 to approach the king and plead the cause of the Jews. Esther responded in verse 11 by pointing out that, hey, come on, such an approach is almost certainly inviting a death sentence. Mordecai persisted, and his response in verse 14 is a very persuasive one, and it's one of the key verses in the whole book of Esther. And if you're familiar with the book of Esther at all, it's probably this verse that you're familiar with. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. It's interesting to note Mordecai's confidence. There would be relief and deliverance for the Jews, either through Esther or by some other means. And perhaps in his grief and fasting, he'd come to realise that God would preserve his people. Being no doubt about it, God will accomplish his purposes. And just as he accomplished them in Esther's day, so in our day and generation, his will prevail. And as Christians, we have our part to play in that. God is gracious in the way that he chooses to use us. He chooses you and he chooses me. And however weak and fallible we may perceive ourselves to be, God uses us in all sorts of ways. But there is a sense in which we can resist him. Like Esther, there may be times when we're brought into a particular position or gifted in God's service in a particular sphere, but we find ourselves at a crossroads. We're wondering whether we can serve him. We're wondering whether we should serve him. We're wondering whether the cost of serving him is too high or too risky. Perhaps we used to serve well, but really no longer use the gifts that he's given us. There's a warning in verse 14 for us. If we don't put our hand to the task in those situations that God has given us, he will still accomplish his purposes, but through some other means. If we resist him, if we ignore him, if we choose not to serve him, then he may well choose to bypass us. And in the New Testament, James chapter 4, verse 17 warns us, if anyone knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it, it's sin. And perhaps some of us find ourselves at times faced with a choice. Do we ignore God's call on our life, or do we obey it? Do we stick with the status quo, or do we take what in the short term, and take in a sense what in the short term might be the comfortable option, or do we strike out for God? Do we stick with the status quo? If we do that, then we risk God bypassing us. We need to be clear, it wasn't an easy choice for Esther. She was queen. She had the security of the palace. She was comfortable. For the time being, she was secure. It seems at this point she might not have perhaps revealed publicly that she was a Jew. Perhaps it would have been easier to remain silent than to approach the king and face the possibility of a capital sentence. Yet Mordecai's words must have rung in her ears. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? God guides the events in individual lives. God orders the world events to achieve his purposes. Psalm 47, verses 7, I think, and 9 tell us that God is the king of all the earth. And, this is the key point, as well as being king of all the earth, the kings of the earth belong to him. So it was no random stroke of luck that Esther won that beauty contest. It was no accident that she was queen of the Persian Empire. Yet she still had a choice to make. And perhaps we have situations where we have choices to make. Might not be a choice that faces us with imminent death. Nevertheless, it's significant for us. Does it help us to reflect on the decision that Esther came to? She chose courageously to step out in faith, and so at the end of verse 16, she's recorded as saying, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Now, she wasn't reckless in saying that, because she committed it to God, because she instructed that there would be 3 days of fasting before she approached the king. So her courage, commitment, her decision came as a result of Esther and God's people seeking his face through fasting. Did she know she was doing the right thing? It was high risk. Perhaps she could wait for the king to call her. The clock had started ticking, but there were still 11 months before the heinous law would be put into effect. Was she rushing? Was an immediate approach to the king within God's will? She can't have known for certain, but she stepped out in faith. And it's only with hindsight that she knew with absolute certainty that she'd done the right thing. And so it is with us. We step out into what we believe to be the will of God at times, and we don't know for certain until we've taken the first step. It's retrospectively that we discover with certainty that we did the right thing. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 tells us that we're called to live by faith and not by sight. So if we find ourselves at a point of decision, if we find that God is calling us to do something, are we prepared to stand and be counted? Are we prepared to take that step? The final verses of Esther chapter 4 actually move us to personal reflection. What is God doing in my life? What does he want me to do? Esther's response was, I will go. And she did in chapter 5. She approached the king, and the golden scepter was held out, indicating that she was accepted. Not only was she accepted, the king was immensely generous. In verse 3, he told her that she could have up to half of his kingdom. It was sure confirmation that God was going ahead of her. And then after the generosity of the king, Esther being the book of Esther, we get another twist. We might have expected Esther to have pleaded the case of the Jews, but she didn't. She didn't rush. She didn't blurt out what was on her heart. Instead, she proposed, let's have a banquet. Why? Well, perhaps she knew the king well enough to know that he enjoyed nothing more than a good party. And if you recall, that's how Esther chapter 1 opened up. So perhaps he would be more predisposed to listen to her plea if he'd enjoyed a good feed. And they say, don't they, that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Dare I say this? Esther maintained an air of intrigue and kept him guessing in only a way that a woman can. She was using her charm and her womanly wiles. She was using her God-given intuition and intelligence to approach the king in a way that would secure the best possible outcome for her people. And so she hosted a banquet for Xerxes and Haman, and then invited them to another banquet the following day, at which all would be revealed. And we get on to that next time. God has gifted each of us with skills and abilities that we can use for him. And our aim should be to serve him with them. And Esther was doing precisely that. And chapter 5 concludes with Haman. Oh boy, was he happy, having had his ego pampered and being invited to this exclusive banquet with Xerxes himself and Esther. But then he exploded in rage because he saw Mordecai not paying him respect. And not only was Mordecai not paying him respect, Mordecai wasn't intimidated by him. And Haman's fragile ego just couldn't take it. And so in verse 13 he said, of chapter 5, all his wealth, all the honour gave him no satisfaction while that Jew Mordecai was sat at the king's gate. And so, at the evil suggestion of his evil wife, Mr. and Mrs. Evil, and his friends, he built the mother of all gallows to hang Mordecai on. And it was the equivalent of the height of a 6-story building. So these gallows, it was going to be a great public spectacle. Little did he know, evil fiend that he was actually building gallows for himself. He was going to get hoisted on his own petard. But that's for next time, whenever next time is, and we get a chance to conclude the story of Esther. And we'll see how God brought salvation to his people. But for now, let's acknowledge, as we reflect on chapters 3 to 5, that human nature hasn't changed. There are still evil men perpetrating evil crimes. It shouldn't surprise us that God's people continue to be hated, and suffering is part of the fallen world that we live in. Let's turn to Christ for the strength to endure. Let's acknowledge too that even though we might not understand, God has his reasons for what we go through. And in the midst of it, let's be encouraged that he is in control. He'd brought Esther to royal position for a purpose. And let's be spurred on by her courage to step out in dangerous faith. Let's step out for God. She faced a tough decision, but she chose wisely. And may our lives be lives of stepping out in obedient faith. May we too make wise, godly choices. And may God bless us as we seek to serve him.